Welcome everybody to this live WSET bite-sized webinar, Regenerating the Future, How the UK Wine Industry is Embracing Sustainable Viticulture. I'm Caitlin, I'm part of the WSET Global Development Team, helping to support our providers and business across the EMEA region. Some of you may already be familiar with WSET, but for those that aren't, the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, WSET, is the world's leading provider of qualifications and courses in wines, spirits, sake and beer. WSET has over 50 years of experience in designing and delivering education to help both professionals and enthusiasts. You can take WSET qualifications in over 70 countries through a network of more than 800 course providers. So if you're interested in finding out more in embarking or continuing your WSET journey, please visit our website at wsetglobal.com. Just to let you know that this webinar will be recorded and available to watch via the WSET Global Events Hub on YouTube, so you can share with your colleagues and friends. I can ask you all, please, to post any questions you have in the Q&A box, and we'll try and cover as many as possible throughout the webinar. And if not, we've got a dedicated time at the end to cover these. So please don't be shy and pop those questions in there. I'd like to introduce you to our wonderful panel of speakers. First, I'd like to introduce Emma Ricks, the Sustainability Executive at WineGB. With a robust background in corporate sustainability and ESG across various sectors, Emma brings a wealth of experience to the industry. In just 4 months at WineGB, she has been instrumental in leading sustainability initiatives and is a dedicated advocate for all things people and planet. Next, we have Anne Jones, who's a highly experienced and influential sustainability advisor for WineGB. Anne has an extensive network of associates both in the wine and sustainability sectors. She is a regular keynote speaker and a respected contributor to a range of written and broadcast publications, bringing immense credibility and strong communication skills to her work. And finally, please welcome Becky Sykes, Programme Director at the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation. Becky is responsible for the Foundation's research, education and engagement, supporting and connecting producers on their regenerative journey. With a passion for this field that began during her master's, Becky brings a unique perspective and expertise in stakeholder engagement, along with a degree in aerospace engineering. So without further ado, let me hand over to our panel of speakers to start the webinar. Thanks all.
Thank you, Caitlin. Good morning, afternoon, or indeed evening, everybody, depending on where you are. It's lovely to see so many friendly names in the attendee list. Please do throw us all of your questions. As Caitlin has just heard in your introductions, you've got a really interesting, diverse set of experience and expertise here between us. And if we can't answer something, we'll try our very best to find somebody that can. So please do pop your questions in the Q&A. The brief that we were given for today is on your screen, and I'm sure this is why you've signed up, so I won't read it all out. But effectively what we're going to go through today is a brief overview of the UK wine industry. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the practices that UK wine producers are employing in their vineyards, what that sustainability context is in the broader spectrum of sustainability. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation and the activity that it's doing within, particularly for the UK producers within the context of this webinar. But obviously we're prepared to talk more broadly about regenerative viticulture if that is of interest. So first of all, we are going to give a brief overview of UK viticulture, because I can see lots of really interesting people on the call, some of whom may have a little bit of context of the UK wine industry, but for some of you this may be new news. So a little bit of context. Within the context of climate change, there's often a perception that the UK is benefiting from climate change. But one of the, I'm reluctant to use that term, because climate change is change. It's not just warming. We've got this sort of inconsistencies and positives and negatives. But one of the things that we have seen from climate change is this sort of gradual increase in temperature, which has enabled the UK viticultural industry to expand at quite some pace. So you can see the chart on the right here demonstrating that plantings are up 510% since 2005. I first joined the industry. In fact, I first stood at my first vineyard planting in 2008, and it's just been exponential since then. We have traditionally focused on traditional method sparkling. We do have in certain parts of the south of the UK, we have fairly similar soil structure to Champagne. So those traditional methods, traditional varieties for traditional method sparkling has been what our fame has been predicated on. However, the still production now, as with these rising temperatures and enabling better physiological ripeness and better sugar ripeness, we're now seeing the much more potential for still production, which is now 31%. So if you haven't looked out any of our traditional sort of Chardonnay varieties, but within still wine, I'd strongly suggest that you do, because they're now becoming increasingly good quality. 10.7 million bottles of annual production, and now probably approaching 1,500 vineyards, many of whom maybe don't have commercial production, and 240 wineries, which is a huge increase. Next slide, please. It has recently launched its new website, which is very exciting, and it's got this really amazing interactive map. I think what this picture demonstrates is that no longer is viticulture in the UK concentrated in that kind of southern area, which I think people maybe have an assumption that it is. Actually, some of the fastest growing vineyard space is actually in Essex now, both for quality and for quantity. But as you can see here, we've got vineyards spread all over the UK, and there are also a few in Scotland. I think they would probably be the first to admit that the wine maybe is not quite as ripe as but maybe they're hedging their bets for a little bit more climate change. But the top planted counties in the UK, the data is there if you'd like to use it more. So how is viticulture in the UK affected by climate change? We've talked a little bit about rising temperatures. We've seen quite a few degrees over the last few years. I think we all know that the 1.5 degree increase that was expected to be limited by the Paris Agreement has now been exceeded. But it's not just rising temperatures. Extreme weather events are probably the biggest issue. In terms of whether that's excessive rainfall or storms. And actually, it's also about the evening out of the seasons. We no longer see quite as extreme a winter, and then that sort of very manageable and consistent spring, summer. Actually, we're finding that the warmth is perhaps coming earlier, like in this year, which is changing the ripening season. Water management is hugely important. So in the rest of the world, we're seeing lots of drought areas. And actually in the UK, a lot of the challenges, and Becky will be able to speak to some of the practices that we're looking into for this later on. Actually, it's not so much not having enough water, but it's having the right amount of water at the right time and not having too much water. Increased vintage variation. I think most producers are pretty pleased with this year. I mean, there's a bit of a fingers crossed as we go into harvest itself. But actually, the previous year was very challenging. The year before that was a bumper crop. And with the increased vintage variation comes increased quality variation. And the benefit of sparkling is that with a lot of blending, you can mitigate that. But equally, it's a challenge for sales channels in understanding how much product you're actually going to have to deal with. The biggest problem for the UK viticultural industry and climate change is within issues, particularly fungal disease, and then the treatments that are required for that. The move within the industry is to try and mitigate and reduce the use of chemical inputs. And again, Becky will talk to that a little bit more later. But actually, when you've got high fungal disease, that's really challenging. Tradition versus innovation, this is always a challenge, and probably those words are on every wine producer's website. But actually, what's exciting for UK viticulture is because of climate change and the fact that it's a relatively new industry, we don't necessarily have such that we have to stick to. So actually, it's enabling the UK wine industry to be a lot more adaptive with its practices, and indeed with its wine styles. And then climate change particularly affects viticulture in terms of the ability to get your pricing right. within the industry. If you're on any of the wine GB groups, you'll hear a lot of talk about labour availability, and that's partly because of the changing of the seasons, as we've talked about, actually changing of harvest times, changing of requirements, and when that labour is required, it's not a consistent year-on-year cost, and it's not a consistent year-on-year set of timings. So we now talk very briefly about what the opportunities are within the UK that are related to climate change and to climate adaptation. Climate adaptation and adaptation is one of the key parts now of looking at environmental and sustainable policies. Actually, how do we manage our land so that we are best adaptable to whatever the future is going to bring to us in terms of weather and climate? So the opportunities that are the most important, I think everyone is now beginning to understand that if we don't protect our soil health is the absolute bedrock of all of this. Without good quality soil, we don't have a good quality crop, and we don't have a good quality industry. If we cannot focus on soil health, then we are stabbing ourselves in the foot for our development as an industry. And in order to focus on soil health, actually all the practices that we talk about later are all about increasing soil health. But also within that come the positivities of improving habitats, improving biodiversity, both above and below ground. Soil health, the and human there is because actually chemicals are obviously impactful for humans, and they can be quite toxic. So reducing that will also benefit human health. Sequestration is a huge opportunity. Becky always teases me because I can talk about carbon removals for a really long time. But carbon removal effectively is the word for sequestration. So when we take carbon out of the atmosphere, the plant effectively manages it for us and then locks that carbon away into the soil, either at a top level or at a very deep level. And that is one of the incentives that the government or governments globally are now looking to effectively give financial imperatives so that we can improve that to reduce carbon out of the atmosphere. So actually the opportunity is huge in order to actually benefit and mitigate climate change at a much broader level. We also have opportunities within organic, biodynamic and regen, which we'll talk about in more detail later. But it's not just about returning to viticultural practices from many years ago. This is not, sometimes people think about sustainability in agriculture as a backward step. And while there are things that we can learn from viticulture before World War II, actually we're also taking the very best of modern technology to make sure that if we do need to use treatments, we're doing it in the most precise way possible, and we're minimizing inputs, and we're not having to just spray things because we feel we have to, because that's what we've always done, but actually being very precise. And there's lots of brilliant climate adaptation, new technology, from soil acoustic probes to real-time nutrient analysis to precision sprayers, robotics, drones, all sorts of exciting things, which again, we can talk to a little bit later. And other considerations, I talked a little bit about carbon sequestration, but the carbon markets are going to really drive change in all businesses, but particularly within viticulture, because we have this amazing sort of spread between being in the vineyard, but also having to sell our product ourselves and this corporate element. So actually, yes, we're having to report and reduce our emissions, but we also have this potential huge benefit of being rooted in the ground, being rooted in soil. We have land, we have the most amazing ability to improve environmental environments for life, for birds, for the people that are in the vineyards, but also back to soil health. I'm going to keep reporting soil health quite a few times. If that's the one message that everyone takes away today, that we're all trying to focus on and improving the health of the soil in the UK, that's the key thing. And actually, all of these other things that I've put in here are all actually part of that incentivization, whether that's natural capital. So there are these benefits from the UK government, such as sustainable farming incentives, which some of you, I can see some producers on the call, currently paused, but they are coming back later in the year. There are capital grants for sustainable investments. There's biodiversity net gain, which is enforcing land developers who are creating, for example, new housing, that they have to demonstrate that they are improving the natural habitat around them with a 30-year horizon. and then the actual value of the land itself. British politics is as tricky as any other political environment, if not more so. But there is this move, particularly that the carbon market is a juggernaut and it's not going to stop. And so now are looking at incentivizing good natural capital. And I think there's also with that, if you're creating great natural capital and reducing chemical inputs, then you're also creating a much better environment for the people around you, and community relations, and being able to drive sustainable tourism is one of YGB's other focus areas to enable viticulture as a whole in the UK to benefit from its sustainable considerations.
Oh, it's me. Thanks,
It is you. Over to Emma.
So some examples of sustainable viticulture practices in the UK are on the screen. Just to go through them a bit. These are tools that people are using to be more sustainable in their vineyards. So these are all covered also in the WineGB certification called Sustainable Wines of Great Britain, which we'll go into in a sec. And they are reduction in under-vine mowing, so making sure that producers are reducing the amount that they're going over their soil in between vines and reducing compaction. Pewees, which Anne has informed me was this year's diploma paper for the WSET. And I think, Anne, do you want to kind of just tell people what a pewee is in case they're not sure?
Yes, for the first time, having marked 120 odd of these papers, I can now actually say the word. Pewees stand for Pilzwiderstandsfähig Verboten, and they are hybrids of disease-resistant varieties, particularly designed to be fungal disease resistant, but also to be adaptive to climate change. So to be able, for example, Solaris is great for colder climates. So actually, I think the UK has quite a good prevalence of pewees. There are some Scandinavian countries that have even more, but certainly there are growers in the UK who are using pewees to mitigate their risk. You could also use them within a blend rather than it just being a single varietal. And so, yeah, we've while our fame as a wine producing region is on traditional varieties, there are producers using significant portions of pewees in their production.
Thank you very much. Estate conservation, so this is looking at biodiversity, and a lot of vineyards are in beautiful areas of the English countryside, and it's about maintaining those spaces. A lot of our producers have forests and other kind of environments within their vineyard as well, so it's just about making sure that they're maintained along with their vineyards. Cover crops, which you can see an example of behind Becky's head. These are when you have rows in between your vines with other kind of crops. I think Becky will go into that a bit more, as I know it's involved with regenerative viticulture as well. Reduction in herbicide and pesticide use, which is kind of what it says on the tin, so reducing the amount of inputs into the environment and into the soil. And then a secondary use of grape mark, so reducing the waste that you're producing when you're making wine. We have some members that will turn it into compost and go back onto the vines, and we have some members who sell it to local zoos, and yeah, it's really interesting to see what people do with it. I think one producer even makes gin from it, so it's quite a diverse tool for them. So Sustainable Wines of Great Britain, it's an opt-in scheme for WineGB members. These stats are from our 2024 impact report. So at the time, it was covering about 40% of the English wine industry. We have a lot of the kind of major players, if you like, in the UK wine industry on the scheme. And it meant that, yeah, about just under 50% of hectarage in the UK was covered by the scheme. We have 70 members, and they go through different levels of certification. So your first, when you start, is your green audit, which is slightly easier than your gold audit. When you get to your second audit, we expect to see some improvement and some targets being met. And then other people have signed up and they're just starting to do their data collection. So SWGB measures and encourages reporting. So some of the things on here, so on the left you can see are what members will be collecting during, for the scheme. So they do a full carbon footprint using a free tool that WineGB provide, carbon calculator. They measure their biodiversity, so this could be through plants and animals. We ask them to report on their energy and water usage and waste, and then also, as Anne mentioned earlier, their sequestration through maybe their hedgerows or their the forests, or however they have on their vineyard. And then we ask our members to set targets as well. So they have a section in the scheme called Evaluation and Planning, where they're asked to do SWOT analysis on the different things that we ask. So, for example, their soil health. And this is just making sure that members are thinking about these aspects. And then they use those SWOT analysis to then set SMART targets, which they then revisit on their every 3 years when they're re-audited. And yes, so SWGB is also recognised by trade. So we have, for example, good relationship with M&S, who recognise the scheme, and it's important to them because they want to be selling wines that are aligned with their own sustainability goals. And we also speak to the government often. They're interested in our opinion on the sustainability things. How much they listen or implement is another story, but that conversation is there, which is good. Some more stats from our recent impact report. So this was a breakdown. We sent out a survey to our whole membership and then used the statistics and information gathered by the hub and the scheme itself. So the numbers you can see here are percentage of our membership. So 62% of our membership, for example, are using renewable energy in their wineries. And then 91% of our members are participating in some kind of floor management. So making a conscious effort to not over mow or anything like that. And 84% are focused on their biodiversity as well. So examples of biodiversity might be good efforts like having log piles. Some people have bug hotels, which are really fun if you've ever seen a bug hotel, bat boxes and things like that. So some of the challenges our members have reported having with sustainability initiatives, so not just our own, but in general, the cost. So a lot of WineGB's members specifically are really small members, and they might not actually be able to afford to change how they're already operating. Consumer expectation, so different consumer groups have different priorities. Some want to come to the vineyard and see that kind of beautiful luxury Instagrammable vineyard, which sustainable viticulture doesn't always lean into. Some really care about the price of the product, and where there's maybe higher startup costs for sustainability activities, it then is going to put the price of the product up. Whereas others do want a brand that kind of aligns with their own sustainability ideas and expectations. The location of the vineyard may not lean itself to some of the practices that Becky will go through later. Government regulation, so where, for example, the SFIs have recently been redacted, and as I mentioned, they hopefully come back later in the year, but that will stop some people being able to implement changes that they want to do. Weather, obviously it's really unpredictable, and so it's really hard to say we're just not going to spray at all, for example, and because of disease pressure that comes from changing weathers. And then conflicting priorities, so where again that's kind of related to all of the above. It may just be something that keeps getting pushed down their to-do list. And then over to Anne.
Thank you very much. So we are now going to take a look at UK viticulturists have been doing when they potentially want to do a little bit more than SWGB. So SWGB is a really amazing framework for helping producers to understand and then to understand what the next steps they might want to put in place are to become more sustainable. And so once vineyards potentially want to enhance their biodiversity even further, what is it that they might want to do? Next slide. Thank you very much. So one of the questions that we often get at the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation is what the relationship is between regenerative viticulture to organic and biodynamic. And one of the things that we say is that all the best regenerative vineyards are organic and the best organic vineyards are regenerative. Regenerative is not a certification scheme in its own right. So organic is a certification scheme that is consistent, and same with biodynamic. We often say that organic's greatest strength is also its greatest weakness, which is that it is a consistent standard globally. So you know what you're going to get. You have minimum standards, you have maximum inputs, and so people and consumers have an understanding of what that means. However, the challenge with that is that it is consistent globally. And it's the same with biodynamics. There's a set processes that you have to go through in order to become certified. Whereas regenerative was always more of a mindset and a set of practices. And that is its greatest weakness, in that it is not, maybe it doesn't have the definition in the same way that organic does. And there are lots of different certification schemes popping up for regenerative now. There's regenerative organic, there's certified regenerative, and there are plenty more that I'm sure we can mention. That there's a comparison of all those different certification schemes on the RVF's website. So there's also a lovely phrase that we heard actually on a regenerative producer's vineyard the other day, which is that organic sort of sets a floor. It tells you what you cannot do, and in order to become any worse, whereas regenerative kind of enables a ceiling. You just can continue becoming more and more regenerative. There's never an end goal. We often say that you can't have a regenerative wine because actually regenerating is a process. So I think those are probably the key differences, that regenerative is a set of practices that layer on top of each other, whereas organic and biodynamic are by definition certifications. So regenerative agriculture. It's also important to remember, sometimes it's difficult to remember, that actually we're not alone in viticulture. We're part of a much broader agricultural system. So regenerative agriculture is a holistic system of farming. These pictures are just a bit of an example, but actually it's very easy to get into an annual cycle. And yet within viticulture, we're very used to the fact that it takes 5 years to get your first crop. Yes, nature is on a kind of annual cycle, but it's not necessarily the same every year. So actually we're looking at a perennial sort of polycultural system that actually it's looking at your land holistically, and I'm going to repeat myself, your soil health, rather than just being a monoculture and just trying to get a crop. We've come out of the need to just be reliant on yield. Wine is by definition a luxury product. It's not a necessity. So actually, if we're going to be luxurious, let's do it properly. Actually, it's not just about driving for the biggest yield possible. Actually, it's about quality, and it's about it's about land stewardship. And it's about working with nature to allow nature to do its problem. One of the things that is most wonderful about regenerative is when a piece of land is in balance, you actually have to do very little. It will help you do your job for you and create a lovely crop. But actually, we all now just have to understand how to transition and allow nature to become in balance. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation. I'm just going to swap my hats. I work for WineGB. I'm a consultant, but I'm also development director for the RVF. And the RVF is a global non-profit that focuses on transforming the wine industry globally through encouraging regenerative farming practices. Not just encouraging them, but also about creating the tools to enable producers to be able to create and develop more regenerative practices themselves. So it's how we do that. We do that through three main ways. Science, as you'll all have understood from Becky's introduction, she's the one with the science background. And she also, I love one of her phrases is that she reads everything so that you don't have to. So reading all of the scientific research papers and then condensing that into something that is relevant and helpful for producers and communicating it in a way that is easy to digest. And then we have various different support tools that we'll talk about a little bit later. So the RVF has this goal that 10% of the world's vineyards will be farming regeneratively by 2035, which doesn't sound that ambitious, but actually when you think about the fact that organics is only about 8%, it is quite ambitious. I think sometimes those of us who work in sustainability overstate just how big organics is. Consumers can see it and they can trust it, but actually it's really hard to do. One of the other issues with organic viticulture in the UK specifically is that it's such a wet climate. And if you are spraying a non-systemic fungicide, so systemics are when it kind of, you will hate me for this because it's going to be a very non-scientific example, but systemic chemicals kind of get right into the heart of the plant and get to work. Whereas the non-systemic, like a copper spray, just sort of sits on the surface. That then gets washed off and ends up in the soil, which can be quite toxic potentially to sheep, as I've been reminded by this beautiful picture here. And so actually, in order for UK vineyards to be organic, it's actually very difficult and potentially requires quite a high dosage of copper. And we're seeing restrictions. In fact, we've just seen some restrictions come through in France on the amount of copper that can be used, which may potentially limit organic viticulture even further. And so the way that the RVF is countering this is by helping producers understand how to look at their soil health holistically and their land health, and in order to become more regenerative. And if we can get to 10% by 2035, then we'll consider that we've made a huge difference to the health of the planet. So what are the benefits of regenerative viticulture? And I can see that we've got participants from all over the world. So if you can see, if you understand these, then potentially the word regenerative may not be one that you're familiar with. People sometimes call it agroecology, but actually it's just about how we are bringing back to life and enabling them to do the job that they are naturally wanting to do. So first of all, it's climate resilience, sequestering carbon, reducing emissions, and adapting to extremes of climate, increasing biodiversity above and below ground. And that's really important. If you're not used to thinking about biodiversity, you may often look at biodiversity in ways that we're used to seeing with our own eyes. So potentially, butterflies, bees, birds. But actually, it's really important to think about the below ground biodiversity as well. Becky may talk to that a little bit later, but actually insects are hugely important to our soil health. Water stewardship is really important, retaining it, but also making it managed healthily in a way that enables extreme water to flow off, but also if in cases of drought to be able to act more consistently across the year. I mean, I've said soil health before. I'm going to say it again. Soil health is really important, rebuilding organic matter, fertility and microbial life. And that's, as we talked about, one of the key benefits of the regenerative approach. Lowering chemical inputs and improving farmer livelihoods. One of the things that has stuck with me recently is one of our RVF has got a trial vineyard in the US where he's kept a few hectares being farmed conventionally with all the sprays you'd expect and all the chemical inputs, and the rest of their properties has been completely transformed to regenerative. And it turns out that actually they're really struggling to get people to work in a conventional side, because they have to put their protective suits on, they have to go and mix their chemicals, put them on the back of the tractor. And actually, they would all far rather be working in the regenerative side, walking through wildflowers. So actually, it's really brought home to us how much better it is to work in regenerative vineyards that are in harmony with nature. They're happier. They often say they feel more hopeful. And I think we can't underestimate how important that is for our industry as a whole. Forestation is also really important for improvements in habitats. And I think deforestation, and Becky's probably much more of an expert than I am on this, but I think that's key elements that we are working to. I think those are the main key benefits of the regenerative approach. So looking now in practice, that actually mean when it comes into the vineyard? So as I said before, we're not just viticulture, we're also part of the wider agricultural element. And that's actually also really important from a carbon perspective, because regulations, if anyone has heard of COP and all of the big global debates around agriculture and making sure that we minimize our climate impact and our carbon emissions, whilst also feeding the world. Actually, those regulations and all of that sense of direction will also impact viticulture. And the main principles are the ones that you can see on the screen: minimising soil disturbance, maximising crop diversity, keeping the soil covered, maintaining living roots year round, and integrating livestock. Now, those are the practices, and I think Becky's going to talk again in a moment about how those break down in even more detail in UK viticulture. But actually, the first principle here is the one that to me is most important. So sometimes you'll see those other 5 stated alone, but actually understanding the context of your farm and of your land is the first and most important principle of regen, because actually without that, you can't understand what help nature needs in order to regenerate itself and to get itself back in balance. And so therefore, understanding your context enables you to understand the balance of these other practices and which are the most important for your land. Over to Becky.
Hello, everybody. It's really, really lovely to be here to talk about regenerative viticulture and how it is being implemented in the UK in particular. I'm going to try to avoid using the phrase soil health as many times as Anne has. It is a slight obsession of ours. And I love the fact that Anne says everything I'm going to explain in more detail. So here we go. At the RVF, what we're doing is we're working to give producers who are interested in farming with regenerative practices everything they need to be able to do so. Because if you think about the way that farming is set up, people have many decades of experience, sometimes centuries, sometimes generations, and they have the same agronomists and advisors and consultants and that whole network of support around them. And if those people aren't used to regenerative farming, then we need to provide that support for people so that they know where to turn in it when they've got any questions and things like that. So I'm not going to read the slide out. Emma, on to the next one, please. Right, this is how we have interpreted those 6 principles of regenerative agriculture for regenerative viticulture. We have 16 topics here, or practices we call them, and this is what we are providing information on and encouraging growers to implement. So monitoring soil health, this is really actually fundamental, that in order to know whether you're improving things, you have to know where you started from. So you need to take some baselines and see how microbially active your soil is. Farmers have a lot of experience of looking at the chemical and physical composition of their soil. What we actually want to know is what the microbial life is like in the soil, because that is what's going to help that soil get back into balance, bring nutrients to the vine without having to use lots of fertilizers, hopefully, and build resilience in the soil and in the vine. Decompaction, when people are driving their tractors up and down the same rows for decades, if you think the vines are in the soil for 25 years minimum, hopefully a lot longer than that, people are driving heavy tractors up and down, that soil gets very decompacted. So working to reduce that compaction, often using plants growing with different rooting depths is what we advise people to do. So that you can try and make air gaps in the soil, which makes it much healthier for all the microbes in the soil and helps water filter into the soil much better. Anne talked earlier about extreme weather events. When we get a lot of these extreme precipitation events with a lot of rainfall, now what happens is it often just kind of rushes straight off the soil. Doesn't have time to filter into the soil, especially if that soil is quite hard. And what we want to do is actually help that rainwater to filter into the soil, to slow down, to be stored, and decompacting the soil is really fundamental to that. Bringing in animals, we often see this is what we see on Instagram all the time, someone showing lovely sheep in their vineyard. They are providing a really good system, a really good service rather, but it has to be done correctly. If you bring sheep or other animals in without any knowledge or experience, you can actually make things worse. So we help growers to find out how to mimic mob grazing, for example, so the sheep aren't going to nibble the grass or the cover crops all the way down. Insect control traditionally would have been done by insecticides. Traditional conventional vineyards are monocultures. They only crop or only plant growing is often used to be just vines. So there was no opportunity for other insects, arthropods, to actually exist in the vineyards. So we didn't have this healthy predatory system of different insects or things that could eat other ones. So where you have lots of different plants growing and different parts of the vineyard allowed to have trees or hedges or things like that, they provide habitats for predatory insects. So we see a massive reduction in insecticide use, in particular in regenerative vineyards. Soil organic matter, this is where we are talking about increasing the microbial life in the soil, because that's soil organic matter is mainly made up of microbes and things like that. So that's bringing in compost, using things like biochar, other things like that. Ground cover, that is keeping your soil covered as much of the year as you possibly can. I'll talk more about that later, but that's because each of those individual plants growing is acting as a mini solar panel that is creating carbohydrates. It's feeding the soil microbes. Water use, this is where we're talking about slowing down the passage of water, as I talked about, and using less water. Not so much of a problem in the UK, where we don't irrigate our vines, but we can use recycled water for spraying and things like that instead of fresh municipal water. Biodiversity, that comes into that insect control again. And inter-row management, this means in between the vines. So that's what you're going to be growing in between the vines. Behind me, I've got a picture of some lovely clover, people choosing cover crops to go in there. But then how do they manage those? If they are high growing plants, are they going to mow them? Are they going to crimp and roll them like they do in some other parts of the world? We don't see so much of that in the UK. Weed control, in conventional vineyards, there's a lot of herbicide involved in weed control. And then in organics, there's a lot of tillage involved in weed control. So we try and come up with alternatives to that, that reduces massively herbicide use and tillage. Agroforestry is implementation of trees, bringing those in, and shrubs. The undervine management is spelt incorrectly, but never mind. That's about what you do under the row of vines, because that's quite tricky to manage. And some people use specific machinery. That's examples, something called mow and throw. You might mow what's in the interrow and then throw the cuttings under vine. And that can be a very successful way of doing things. Vine fertility and composting. So the fertility of the vine obviously comes from the soil, and what we need to do is boost that relationship. So we want to really improve the soil fertility, so that and make it so that the nutrients in the soil are actually brought to the vine in plant available form. And this is something that has to be done over years of building up that soil health, but that then reduces the fertilizer use, because we often liken using fertilizers to giving the plants kind of McDonald's. Actually, that's not what we want to be doing. They've got this reliance on synthetic fertilizers, which is not ideal for many reasons. So what we need to do is improve the soil health. I've said it again, I'm really sorry. Fungal control, Anne mentioned this earlier, but fungal disease, particularly downy and powdery and botrytis, are real issues in the sort of damp climate of the UK. We can do as much as we possibly can with best practice canopy management and things like that to increase airflow. And we can use pewees that Anne talked about earlier, but you know, fungal control, we use a lot of fungicides, and it's working out how we can reduce those fungicides. And the last one, ecosystem design, is my favorite, because it's essentially where people come to design their vineyards or retrofit their vineyards with the whole ecosystem in mind, because we can talk about these individual practices separately, but actually we're talking about how they all interact with each other in this ecosystem, and the way that they connect is so complex that it's quite difficult to study and quite difficult to implement. Next slide, please. Sorry, I spoke for a very long time on that slide. I can only apologize. So for regen in practice, what we're trying to do here, this is an example of how you can go about repairing damaged soils. So a lot of people find that their soils are pretty unhealthy, and they realize that they really do need to do something about it. The man who set up our foundation, Stephen Cronk, bought a domain in the south of France. I've gone off the UK topic, but very briefly, he bought this. He wanted to improve his soils because they were so damaged. And he found that going organic was not going to be sufficient to actually regenerate his soil. So in order to regenerate our soils, what do we need to do? So in the UK, with cover crops, what we're doing is we don't want to till or plough the interrow in order to put the seeds in, because that will cut up our mycorrhizal fungal networks. So we use direct drilling as much as we can. Not everybody can, some situations you can't, but this is the ideal, is the special machinery attachment that puts the seeds directly into the soil without disturbing the soil. So that's to get your cover crops, hopefully lots of different seeds, sometimes up to 18 different varieties of seed go into the cover crop to come up this year, and then to come up as perennials each year. So with different rooting depths to try and break up the compaction of the soil. We use sheep as the main livestock integrated into UK vineyards. Sometimes we see chickens, but mainly we're talking about sheep, and managing that grazing. And that relationship here in the UK is different to how it is in some of the other countries. In some countries, people will pay the grazer to come in with their sheep. And in other countries, it can be known for the grazer to actually pay the vineyard for actually giving the grazing for the animals. Here in the UK, it's generally a symbiotic relationship where no money usually changes hands. So because the person with the sheep is looking for some nice dry land in the winter that they can graze their sheep on, and the vineyard manager is looking for someone to come and basically mow their grass and provide some sheep poo and urine in the winter. So it's a win-win situation, which is just wonderful. Organic matter additions, we're talking here about improving our soil. So cover crops we've talked about, composting. Some of the best vineyards are managing to create their own compost mounds. This can be a really good example of how we try and have a closed loop farm system. So you might have some manure from another part of the farm, or you might have your pressings from your grapes being brought in for your compost, or grass cuttings from another part of the estate. So trying to make your own compost so that you're not bringing in things from outside. That's not always possible. Sometimes people don't have the expertise. You know, I find it quite difficult at home to compost. It's not that straightforward. And sometimes people don't have the space to do so, and they might bring these things in. There are also organic nutrient additions that people use, but in general, in regenerative viticulture, what we're trying to achieve is reduction in inputs. So we're not usually trying to replace those chemical inputs, chemical fertilizers, with new ones, biological ones. We're actually trying to make this closed loop if we possibly can. Next slide, please. And here we have, so integrated pest management is not a specific of regenerative viticulture. It's actually, you know, good practice viticulture. And what we do find is often that regenerative is really good practice with different innovations on top of it. But this integrated pest management, I don't know if it's a new phrase to people or not, but you're not just spraying on a calendar. What you're actually doing is you're spraying when you've reached a very specific threshold that is a challenge to your crop. So I'm going to go through this a bit more quickly because I think we're going to run out of time otherwise. Avoiding compaction. So we try not to keep driving our heavy tractors up and down as much as, well, we try and reduce how much we drive them up and down, try and do multiple things at the same time. So you might be mowing and strimming or bud rubbing at the same time. And weed control, I've talked about before on the previous slide. Next slide, please, Emma. Oh, this is great, this slide. Sadly, don't have time to go into it in too much detail. It's from Wine Australia, not Wine Astra, as has been cut off. But this is showing you that all the plants in the ground are photosynthesizing. So they are taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they are feeding that. The plant keeps about 60% to itself. It gives about 40% to the microbes via exudates from the roots. That means that the carbon is starting to be stored in the soil. Those microbes in the soil, they have this kind of, sometimes it's called a soil food web, where they eat, they die, they eat each other, things like that. And then some of that gets stored in a very stable form in the soil, and some of it gets formed in a form that kind of is what they call labile. It can be released and move about. But what you don't want to be doing is ploughing that soil, because a lot of those microbes then get exposed to the air, and they respire and they release carbon back into the atmosphere. Let's move on, otherwise we'll run out of time, sorry. This is from our literature review. We published this year a literature review called Climate Change, Regenerative Viticulture and Climate Change Resilience. It has a lot of detail about how carbon is stored in the soil alongside everything else. This was probably the first peer-reviewed article to be talking about regenerative viticulture, and since then there have been 5 have been published citing our work. So there's going to be a lot more studies coming out soon. Next slide. In one of the initiatives we've been doing is this very exciting one called the One Block Challenge. This is how we've been supporting farmers to try regenerative practices on one small parcel of their vines, which reduces the financial risk. There is no financial risk in this. So they're not betting the farm on regenerative viticulture. It's to try out a few practices in a supportive environment where they get peer mentoring from other growers who are maybe slightly further along the regen journey. They can share knowledge, share equipment, source cover crop seeds together. We launched it in California this year, and since then a few other places, but we launched it in the UK in August. So it's going to be starting in the next few months, and we're very excited about this. We've also been doing other events in the UK with growers. We have a Regenerative Viticulture WhatsApp group for growers, and we've done open farm visits where they can go and visit each other's farms, see what's going on. Next slide, please. We launched a new website this week, and on our new website, we have something called a vineyard network. It's got a map of growers around the world who are implementing regenerative practices. I really strongly recommend, if you've got an interest in it, that you go and look at it. This is a snapshot of it, of the ones in the UK, so that you can go and look at their websites, try their wines, go and visit them, and find out who in the UK is trying regenerative viticulture. So who is trying regenerative viticulture? We've got a few examples here, which we probably don't have very much time for if we're going to have questions as well. But let's move on and see what some of them are. Domain Hugo is in Hampshire, and is going to correct me, I think, but had been trialing is organic and also trialing regenerative practices, not trialing, doing regenerative practices, has been doing so for quite a long time. And here are Hugo's sheep. So yeah, lovely photo. There's going to be quite a few nice photos of sheep, I think, coming up here. Next one. Oh no, cover crops. There we go. Lovely. So Gusbourne is in Kent. They've been dipping their toe into regen practices. They probably wouldn't say they were hugely regenerative yet, but they're really, really keen and interested and starting to trial some practices. Next. Ham Street are an amazing place, really. Jules and Lucy have set up their vineyard along regenerative lines. So this is what I was talking about earlier, about this ecosystem design. The entire thing has been set up as along agroecological lines. It's really worth looking them out, and they know a huge, huge amount about regenerative viticulture. Yeah. The Whiston Estate is in Sussex, and their vineyard manager has been really pushing to trial a lot more regenerative practices recently. So here we have another photo of some lovely cover crops in the row on these quite young looking vines, which is great to see. Excellent. Oh, and Harrow and Hope is the vineyard manager there. Matt is absolutely fantastic. He is one of those people who is sharing all his knowledge and expertise with other people and has been working incredibly hard to rebuild soil health there. And at Windsor Great Park Vineyard, which is next to Windsor on the Windsor Castle estate. And his work there to reduce the there it goes down to a lake and had a lot of goose poo there, so he's been working really hard to make his soils much more aerated. We've had a fascinating trip there this year, was absolutely brilliant. Yes. And Ambriel is in West Sussex, and Wendy at Ambriel is extremely knowledgeable about regenerative viticulture. She has had sheep in her vineyard for quite a long time, very successfully, and shares her expertise and her experiences very widely with other people as well. That's one of the things we love about this, is the collaborative nature of the regenerative viticulture movement. So I think, is that the last one? Yes. Back to Anne.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so thank you for your questions. I think we've managed to answer most of them as we go, but if anyone's got any more questions, then this is your opportunity. Otherwise, you can contact us via info@regenerativeviticulture.org from a regenerative practice, or you can contact Emma. Emma, what is the SWGB inbox called again? Is it swgb@ynegb.co.uk?
It is.
It is. So feel free. And frankly, questions to either of those inboxes will probably end up on my desk. But do feel free to send us some emails. I think there's so much. I don't know, Martha's just said Hugo's your favourite fizz at the YGB tasting. Yeah, Domain Hugo, absolutely amazing. Some of the work that's been being done on cover crops in the UK is particularly interesting because of the water management and the climate being quite different actually to lots of other places globally. So looking at Matt in the Windsor Park vineyards, been looking at kind of long rooting depths to help water flow and things, but it's been fascinating. So thank you all very much. If you'd like to fill in the feedback poll or give us any further questions, otherwise I think I'll go to hand back to Caitlin to close. Thank you very much.
I just have one question that came in privately. I'm just asking whether being a young wine region kind of helps or hinders sustainable practices.
That is a great question. I mean, obviously, Becky will laugh because the answer to every single question is it depends. But I think in most cases, actually, it helps in the UK because we find that some viticulturalists in some more established regions find it very difficult to change. Actually, it's not so much the practices that are hard, but it's change and it's transition that's difficult. And if you're following going back to sort of 6 generations ago is fine, but actually if you're trying to do something different to what your father has done and your grandfather has done and your great grandfather has done, that can be a very difficult within a legacy business. And in the UK, we tend to find that it's maybe one generation, if that, and everyone's been learning as they go and everyone's learning together. So I would say that, and also because we've been mindful of climate change from the beginning. So I would say within the UK, it's a help. But
also, can I interrupt you, Anne? Sorry.
Of course.
Also, we don't have the same restrictions that they have in some of the existing wine regions. So, for example, in France, so the very strong appellation rules mean that you can't use pewees, or they're very restricted. The use of pewees is restricted. We know that some have been permitted in Champagne and in Bordeaux recently, but in limited amounts. And so they don't have the opportunities to try new things. So that is being changed in some of those regions in France. But
yeah, it takes a long time. As someone who works with the OIV, I can attest to how long it takes to get things changed. So yeah, I on balance, it's an advantage, but it's not a completely simple picture.
Brilliant, thank you. This has been a brilliant session. So thank you so much to our wonderful speakers, and thank you everybody for watching. The recording of this session will be available to watch on the WSET Events Hub YouTube, where you can also catch up on all of our previous events. So thank you again to WineGB and the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation, and see you at another event soon, I hope.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Yes, thank you.
Bye.